So, Ms. Shlaes, I would like to begin by asking you a little bit about the Calvin Coolidge Presidential Foundation. Could you tell me a little bit about what you all do at the foundation?
Well, one, I want to say thank you all, this crowd, for taking this time to learn about Calvin. And thank you, James, for hosting us, and to ISI. We can't think of a better partner than ISI for the Coolidge autobiography, which is a wonderful book. Coolidge happened to be a great writer. At the Coolidge Foundation, what we do is teach Coolidge principles. Let's just say share Coolidge principles with young people. We believe in Coolidge principles, and we believe young people will see their merit themselves. So we don't pound ideas into young people's heads. We just expose them to what Coolidge thought and let them make up their own minds. Two ways we do this are through our debate program. We have a national debate program, which has been called the gold standard of free market, or let's just say common sense debate for our secondary school kids. Kids argue both sides. They argue for redistribution and they argue against it. That is, they never are stuck on one side. We are not a cheerleading outfit. They learn both. And that is led by a wonderful debate facilitator, teacher, and coach named Jared Rhodes, our debate director. And we do this all culminating in a Coolidge Cup at the historic Coolidge birthplace, where secondary schools have sent kids with scholarships to see where the president lived, see the graveyard and the humble grave, see New England, and breathe the fresh air there, and learn about Coolidge and debate his principles. Secondary to that, what one might also say primary, we have a scholarship for which there is hot contest. We had over 3,000 candidates for 4 scholarships this year. That's because It is, as you it is, as you said, James, a full ride for merit, regardless of background of the child. The candidates compete in part by writing Coolidge essays. They don't have to sound like Calvin Coolidge. They don't have to be Republicans. We have no concern about their own politics, but just that they have an understanding of who Coolidge is and might share some of his values. That helps them to win this prize. So we have a number of Coolidge scholars, those are winner. And then we have a program after that called the Senators, which is for the those who come close but don't win. That would be the top 100. And they come to Washington. We host them. Normally, let's pretend it's a normal year. They learn all about the branches of government in a nonpartisan way, but they also learn about the business that supports government. So they sort of see the Washington that Coolidge knew, and the America that Coolidge knew. So that's what we do. We try to be sure high schoolers and college kids know about Coolidge and his values. This is through a man rather than through a set of ideas, and let them form their own opinions.
That's really wonderful. That sounds like a great program, and I'm sure those students benefit greatly. One thing I want to note to all of our listeners before we move on is that you'll see to the right of the chat, you'll see a Q&A button. If you click on that, you can enter your questions into there. And at the end, during the last 20 minutes, I will ask those questions to Ms. Shlaes. So please drop your questions there. And one of the things you reminded me of as you were talking about the Coolidge Foundation is historical consciousness, which is such an important thing for students to develop. And I want to transfer now to talking a little bit about what you read about in The Forgotten Man, actually. So one of the things you touch on in The Forgotten Man is a depression within the depression. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about what you meant by that and what might have caused this sort of secondary depression.
James doesn't fool around, right? He goes right to the tougher questions. There was a Great Depression in the 1930s. What was great about it? The unemployment was higher than 10% almost all the time. Just so you have context for yourself and your friends. Maybe it was 15%, maybe it was 20%. So what made the Great Depression great? The duration. If you have 1 year of unemployment, well, you might forget that. There was a forgotten depression like that in the early 20s, about which James Grant has written. In the 30s, the depression never went away, or to put it another way, the recovery never chose to come back. Think about it that way. The recoveries are like people. It's okay to anthropomorphize them because they are like people. And the recovery took one look every year and said, no, thank you. Count me out. In the depression within the depression, just when everyone thought things would get better, James, and friends, because, well, they had gotten somewhat better, but just not back to where they had been. There was another downturn, and suddenly this would be in 1937 or 38, unemployment was back to 15%. Well, imagine that 15% unemployment that many years since 1929 with the famous crash that started it all. And that was the depression within the depression. It's very important, because it made the depression great. If 5 years is all right, 10 years is half a generation of downturn. And of course, we want to look very closely at the causes of that. One cause very much under-discovered was that something like the minimum wage, because upward pressure on wages through a minimum wage, but also through union pressure. Unions were very strong then. So think of it as a proxy. Instead of making the wage high, you make the group that can demand the high wage strong, so you can't deny it. That's what happened. We had the Wagner Act, a very strong union law, which is no longer enforced. It was kind of neutered later by Taft-Hartley. Anyhow, the companies had to pay super high wages and they couldn't afford them. Normally, what's your reaction as a parent or employer? You can't quite afford something, well, you give a little less. You say, I love you. I'd like to keep you as an employee. I can't afford the $100 I gave you. I'll give you 94. Live with that. If you stick with me in 2 years, I may be back to 100 or higher. That is the human nature. That's not what happened. The rule was the employers had to pay 110. They couldn't, so they were forced to lay off people, or more importantly, you think about the suppleness of the labor market. They failed to rehire. That's what makes the depression great, when you're laid off and you never have a chance to go back. So that kind of attitude from employers, deriving from the incredible pressure on them in turn from the government to keep wages high for various spurious reasons, made the depression great. In addition, there are other factors. One is the incredible uncertainty of having a president who hated business and said so. He said, I'm going to show business. I'm paraphrasing, so forgive me, but it was such a speech. I am its master. If you tell business you're its master, President Obama never did that. Business is creeped out and it hides. And there was a so-called capital strike because business didn't want to invest under such a president. So when you examine particularly 35 to 40, which is what that second half of the depression, what you see is scared business, intrusive government. At the time, they knew this very well. It's only our history books that have let us down, James. And the chief economist of, I'm thinking Chase Bank, whose name was Benjamin Anderson, said the problem is the government is playing God with the people, the economy, the government. And when the God discovers he's not doing well, the government discovers it's not doing well by playing God. What it does is play God more vigorously. And I like that very much. When you fail with stimulus one, you do stimulus two, stimulus three. You don't say, oh my gosh, maybe stimuli aren't perhaps the answer. It's that kind of vanity, it's virtue signaling in the 1930s variety, right? So 1930s virtue signaling, more stimuli, they didn't work. They were unaware of the effect of inflation, and one could go on, but those are two. Another would be various counter signals from the government, which didn't know what it was doing. There was a doubling of, if you have some technical monetary people on the line, there was a doubling of reserve requirements for banks. Since banks had comfortable reserves due to their inherent caution subsequent to the early 30s, the government assumed that with the doubling of reserve requirements, they already had that doubling. They already met the new requirement that there wouldn't be further squirreling by the banks. But the banks were so afraid that when the doubling of reserve requirements occurred, when they had to reserve more money, they reserved even more. They made an even greater cushion, and that tightened money, as did, for example, the arrival of Social Security, which took money out of the economy as people began to pay to the government you know, you can make a huge list of factors why the Depression continued, but you asked, and I think that these are all very relevant to our listeners.
Well, that's very helpful. And one thing, if I understand my history correctly, these have to do with New Deal programs. And so I'm wondering,
Yes,
can you say something broadly about what the New Deal is? Because what we're trying to do here is develop historical consciousness. Can you help us understand the New Deal a little more broadly, and maybe what ways you might explain the effects today?
Of course, and we have people of different interests, you know, different experience in the audience. I can see there's some fabulous students. I had a look at the list and was overwhelmed. So forgive me if I talk too simply or too complicatedly, right? Everyone is different. Think of it this way. When did government make its most dramatic intervention into the economy? It was the 1930s. The stock market was at 381 in 1929, and it went down almost 90%. Today, we're back where we were. We have no depression. We have a weird unemployment related to a single event, which is the shutting off the economy due to a virus. So they had 25% unemployment. The 381 was down to around 45 or 50. And there was a panic. A president was elected who was pretty conservative, by the way, Franklin Roosevelt, and he said, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. He adumbrated Rahm Emanuel. He said, I'm going to try some progressive policies and see how it goes, given that the economy's on its back anyhow, and everyone suspended disbelief and said, sure, he seems happy. Roosevelt was the happy warrior, and we went along with him, and his project was called the New Deal, as in cards. I will give American workers a new deal, and Americans were being rooked, because an economy that over 10% unemployment is an economy that is rooking you. What the best thing one can do for man or woman? Supply the opportunity to work at a job. That opportunity was not there, and basically the federal government under Franklin Roosevelt, with support of Congress, mounted a progressive shift in our culture through the National Recovery Administration, institutions with really absurd ideas. The NRA's idea was that the government would manage the industrial economy to get recovery. And in Forgotten Man, my book, I describe I give the story of one business. So you can see the premises by which the government operated. One was that consumer choice slows recovery, impedes recovery. Consumer choice, they're so slow picking whether they want a latte and whether they want vanilla in it, that means we don't have recovery. Whereas today we know that crucial nanosecond where you're deciding between flavors in your latte fuels economic growth, doesn't it? You feel awesome. You're very wealthy. You can choose what kind of latte you have, and other people can as well. And therefore the economy grows, and therefore you live in a wonderful knowledge economy. At that time, choice, they were still in the assembly line mentality of productivity, seemed an obstacle. So one of the rules of the National Recovery Administration was that customers could not pick their chicken. They had to take the chicken they got, in this case it was wholesale, put into their hand, because business was so slow, and that was what was making the Great Depression. It was rotten and sort of kind of P.T. Barnum economic theory that was applied in all earnestness by the federal government across the industrial economy. It was incredibly stupid. Their whole books about how stupid it was. They had no idea what they were doing. It just sounded nice. There was an infatuation with the economy of scale. Today we know economy of scale is a limited doctrine in its charm. Sometimes variety and little is better and works better and causes more growth. There was a disregard for productivity, which today we know is very important for economic growth, specifically the quality of economic growth. They got it all wrong, and they kind of realized that in the middle of the New Deal and shifted gears a few times. But the government intervention was playing God stupidly, one might add, most of the time. And therefore, we had this period where for 10 years, our grandparents didn't have jobs, or great-grandparents, or parents, depending on your age. And they were very ashamed. And the stock market did not come back well until the 50s. So imagine if the stock market had just gone down as now, and it wouldn't come back, let's see, 30, 40, for 25 years. So that would mean you'd practically be old if you're a college student, your children would be high schoolers before it got back to the level it was when you decided you were getting married. Maybe they'd be college students. What a loss. So that was the Great Depression. That's what The Forgotten Man is about.
Mm. And what ways are we feeling some of those New Deal policies today?
I think the idea that you play to groups, the Forgotten Man idea is key. I like that idea a lot. Roosevelt spoke of the forgotten man at the bottom of the economic pyramid. That was the speech. Very compelling. Like, forgotten man, yep, forgotten man, forgotten man. But he had borrowed that phrase, and some, I know there's at least one Yale person on this call. I noticed that, from a philosopher at Yale named William Graham Sumner, who scarcely taught at Yale, also my college. And Sumner said the forgotten man wasn't the man at the bottom of the pyramid. It's the man who pays for the work for the man at the bottom of the pyramid. And the question is, if the regular man pays, is he paying for something that will really help the man at the bottom? And is it fair? Because the project may not work at all. And it's the taxpayer or the bystander who's paying for some progressive collective project. So what's relevant about the 30s was their emphasis on the collective, not the individual. And Roosevelt was this master of creating groups and then winning elections with them. If you ever want to study an election, have a look at the 1936 election. Roosevelt told every group they were the forgotten man and did something or other for them. If Black Americans, Howard University, women, XYZ, senior citizens, well, Social Security. And I always wondered as a child, well, how come Roosevelt won all those states? 46 out of 48 states. What a record. Franklin Roosevelt, my mother loved him, right? And then I realized that he had promised things to various constituencies that no president had ever dared promise before. So it's, imagine you're giving an electorate tea, and for a moment you give it heroin. The extent of the political gift. You look at the level of federal spending relative to the spending by states and towns. Up until the mid-30s, states and towns were more important to citizens because they spent more than the federal government, except in wars. But in peacetime, your state or your town, that was your government. That's who paid for the schools, that paid for who paid for the things that mattered to you in your life most of the time. And that was the entity, the municipality or the state to which you paid tax. That shifted. In 1936, suddenly the federal government was bigger than the states and towns combined. And that was a shift that did not reverse, except momentarily, ever after the federal government was bigger than the states and towns combined. So we began to look to Washington, and we did it through groups, not individuals.
That's really helpful. That's really helpful. Thank you. And one of the things we note in the Great Society is that there's this sort of trajectory of New Deal type policies that extend far beyond the New Deal, right? Which move into the LBJ's presidency. And so I wonder if you might talk a little bit about what were some of the problems that were caused by, or let's start with, what was the Great Society? What issues was it trying to solve? And what were some of its issues? What are some of the issues that it created?
Well, James, it's good you mentioned New Deal, Great Society. New Deal's the 1930s. New Deal, the impetus or the occasion for the New Deal was an economic downturn, the crisis. There was almost no crisis in 1960, except for a crisis of idealism, which is very similar to now. Unemployment was low. Prospects were awesome. The prospects, so we were sort of more ambitious because of our own prior and current success. That's like now. So everyone said, we want a great society. They didn't call it a good society, right? A great, a superlative. We want to go to the moon. We want to blah, blah, blah. And the only question domestically was, how do you get to great? Through the public or the private sector? And the consensus became, we do it through the public sector. In the book, I have private sector because the private sector observed this. And it was a little bit of a contest. We decided public, collective, groups, not individuals. Same thing. And that's politics, right? Keynesianism is window dressing for political life. It's economic justification for political activity. That's why it survived, not because it's a doctrine that's proven itself. Politicians like it. So we're going to spend, that'll make the economy grow, and we're going to buy in groups, and they're going to buy into us. That was a great society. It's no accident. Lyndon Johnson was himself a New Dealer as a young man. He was much appreciated by FDR. If you go back, you can find Johnson being praised by Franklin Roosevelt as a wonderful operative of the New Deal. Johnson was, in fact, the leader of the National Youth Organization, and NYA is called administration, under FDR. He's a child of FDR. He had witnessed FDR's success, and he sought to finish the revolution that FDR had started, LBJ. So you see, it's a real arc. And when you look at what the Great Society was, Johnson had three areas of focus. One was classroom, one was cities, and one was countryside. There's a kind of green Johnson. It's very interesting and understudied. And in the cities, he said, and in the countryside, for those two, he said he was going to cure poverty. He didn't say, I will make poverty less. He said, we'll CURE, cure poverty. And that is an example of the Great Society. The sheer ambition is amazing. They spent billions. Now we say trillions. They sent billions. But anyway, what it would be the biggest multiplier you can think of, and then it was billion. On these projects, they didn't work out. Conservatives often went along, or centrists. Why? Just as now, imagine if we have some project to help the disadvantaged feel enfranchised in the cities. Why would a centrist even go along with that, given the record of the failure of such programs? In the vain hope that it might stomp riots or city unrest. You want to save the cities. You want people not to riot. A jobs program, it might not be the way you would do it, but it can't hurt. That was the mentality. What I discovered in researching Great Society was that urban jobs programs sort of that sidelined the police and introduced new, civic groups to enfranchise people, and a community was a word that was also used very much, actually fomented riots. That, if you go back and look, you think of Watts and you'd say, well, they did Watts and then they did community action. On the contrary, the community action was planned before Watts, and certainly before Detroit. What happened that made the whole situation even more incendiary was that the jurisdictions all fought over how the money would be spent or who would control it. Black Lives Matter, to use an analogy, there was, of course, no Black Lives Matter at that time, but there was something like it. Even the Black Panthers fought with the local community group, whom they considered too moderate or inauthentic. And sometimes the money didn't flow or flowed the wrong way. Anyway, when you have money like that, people fight over the money. It was like Colombia with the FARC, where the U.S. subsidizes drug terrorists to make them into vigilante policemen who do no harm. We actually do that in countries to defuse military situations. In American cities, there was money that flowed to gangs, particularly the Black Stone Rangers, for example, in Chicago, in order to civilize them and help them keep the peace. That was a great idea. You're empowering people who have a stake in kind of territory, clan, and violence, and you're not empowering little, high school math students. That's who you should be empowering, so that there'll be more of them. It was very sad. So the long story short, if people talk to you about community involvement, have a look at my chapter 4 of Great Society, which is called The Revolt of the Mayors. About Democratic mayors, nothing, it all repeats itself. As now, the Democratic mayors were the greatest casualties of the Democratic Party's efforts to help communities. They couldn't believe that the federal government was supporting groups who were too radical for their cities and who actually might compete against the mayors politically, because guess who elected Johnson? Those mayors. Mr. J. Daley, the legendary, for example, sent all his ideas for poverty alleviation in a box to Washington after he elected Johnson, as he saw it. Johnson ignored him and worked with radical groups. And Daley just absolutely couldn't believe it. It's hilarious. You're giving money to subversive and hippies. Wait a minute. I am Mayor Daley, who got you elected. So it was a comedy, except that it was so sad. It was farce. We didn't help poor people. We helped social workers.
Thank you. That was really helpful. And one of the things that I noted when I was flipping through Great Society was you start with this great story, and the question therein is why not communism or why not socialism, right? And I think that was certainly a prevalent question among staffers in Johnson's time and before. And I'm wondering, that question has come back. Why do you think?
Why not? That's a great question. Why not socialism? Well, it sounds good, right? It sounds fair. From each, why can't we share? From each according to his ability. But it always starts with a given. Given a strong economy. Given, assume a strong economy. And the economy is a beautiful, lonely, fragile creature. It is not a given forever. So they said, given a strong economy, we owe it to virtue signal. Is really what it is. You want to confront young people head on and say, are you just being vain? Are you just showing off what a good person you are? Because what you're proposing might not work. So let's talk about whether it works rather than how good it makes you look and what group to which you're admitted to because you say X or Y, right? Group you're not excluded from, right? So it sounded good, socialism, because it had never been tried. And then this young man who was he wrote a book that was the hillbilly elegy of the period. It was called The Other America. It was also about Appalachia and the incredible poverty there. Michael Harrington went to Washington and said, why not socialism? And he got to work a little bit on the Poverty Czar's team. And the Poverty Czar's laws were not socialist as in Stalin or Khrushchev, but they were socialist enough to do a lot of damage. I think the lesson of the Great Society is a little bit of socialism does a lot of damage. The sort of compromise among free market people or business people, frankly, is they can have their stuff. Let them have their ethnic studies. Let them have their social welfare program. Just leave me alone so I can run the business. And actually, we'll pay for everything. The business is so awesome, it can pay for everything. That doesn't always turn out to be true, is the problem. The economy can't always afford all that. So we took the economy for granted and we killed our own economy. And that is why the 70s were such a purgatorial decade. 70s were a sad decade. I grew up in that decade. It was a decade when your house had 2 fewer bedrooms than you wanted, and you really couldn't have that many children because the interest rate was over 15%. And you might not get another job, and ideas stayed on the shelf. There were plenty of good innovations that had been patented that were on the shelf, not in the store, because the cost of capital was very, very high. So if your dad or granddad was operating in that time, what you'll hear is, I had an idea, but I never realized it. Unless they lived in New York where we have funny money. Otherwise, so all across the Midwest, people had good ideas and still they struggled. And maybe in 1978, they said, you thought you might be going to Beloit, but instead you're going to Illinois State, which is a fine school, but you want to go to Beloit. I'm making up an example, no offense to either institution, because I have $4,000 less for your college than I thought. Parent to child. And it was a decade of disappointment. It was a decade of a sense of scarcity, which was completely artificial. We thought we could never turn the thermostat above 68 again because we were running out of energy. Jimmy Carter wore those sweaters to keep warm. And this was all because we were not allowing the economy to do what it can do for us.
Yeah, that is a problem. Whenever we suffocate the economy, we see that. And now I would like to transition a little bit over to President Coolidge. And one way I would like to introduce Coolidge to our viewers tonight is to think about him in the context that you put him in The Forgotten Man. Coolidge coming up around the same time as President Hoover. And you talk about the sort of distinct type of conservatism that these two had. And I wonder if you could flesh that out a little bit for us. Put Coolidge in his context as he's coming in.
Well, you think about what is a conservative or what is a free marketeer, right? When you're picking a presidential candidate, for example. These were two different types. Hoover was actually a very impressive man. He was, they said, the best paid young man of his generation, and that was because he did something no one else could do. He knew about mining, but overseas people did not know about mining, even mighty British investment banks, for example, Barings, and they did not know how to get copper out of the ground or oil or coal out of the ground. We were a little bit in the van in the United States, particularly after the gold rush of 1848. We learned about getting gold out of the ground. Hoover happened to go to Stanford. Good luck. He happened to study with the most awesome mining engineers. He happened to be one of those young men who instantly becomes the intern and does a very good practical work. He's one of those interns you want to rehire because he gets everything before you ask. Was very clever and very responsive to whatever the task at hand was, not a big talker in that way. And he went all around the world working for banks and companies, rationalizing their minds. He's enormously successful. And then is so much so that he shifted, it became sort of an investor himself in the things that he fixed. He had ceramic factories in Russia. He was based in London. He was just amazing. He lived in China through the Boxer Rebellion with his wife, Lou. He had translated things from Latin into English with his wife. He was amazing. And he rescued the starving Belgians in World War I by supplying them with food. So you imagine a guy who's the smartest guy in every room he walks into, accustomed to that and very special. To be loved and appreciated for being the smartest guy. That was Herbert Hoover. I kind of think he's like the Romneys. We would call it McKinsey consultant, or he's a consultant. And you know what? He might be a strong personality, but heck, he knows more than anyone else. So we should listen to him. And often he was right. Cool. That's the kind of president he was. And in his confidence in himself and his need to dominate the room rather than work a compromise, he was more like Theodore Roosevelt than some other presidents. That is, I am the center of attention. I am the bride at every wedding, the corpse at every funeral, is what they said about TR. I have to be the center of attention. And Coolidge didn't like that. Coolidge was a different type. Coolidge said that called Hoover Wonder Boy, and that was not a compliment. Wonder Boy over there at the Commerce. Who needs a Commerce department anyhow? If you're a free marketeer, what is Commerce supposed to do? They get in the way of commerce, right? He would say, well, what is he doing over there? One of the things that Commerce did was NOAA weather, putting the fishes to bed at night and turning the lights off at the lighthouses. Coolidge really didn't like Hoover. You didn't know that publicly because both of them were gents and didn't say negative things about each other. That they understood the value in that. Coolidge was much more restrained, much moved incrementally, believed in party. There's a strong Burkean element to Coolidge. You cannot find much about him with Burke, so you just have to assume he inhaled his Burke, not quoted his Burke. He was more of a solicitor than a barrister as an attorney. That is, he would tend to compromise and make the deal and subordinate his own desires most of the time to the powers in the room. We all come in, we want to come out with an outcome. What is my role to make that outcome happen, not to show off, even if I know I'm right. Very different type. What did Hoover have that Coolidge didn't have? Energy. What did Coolidge have that Hoover didn't have? Modesty. And also, because he didn't express his opinion or fight on principle all the time, when Coolidge did pick a fight, he had so much capital in the bank with his colleagues that they would back him. So from time to time, Coolidge would fight a fight on principle and he would win because he had fought so few other fights. If you think about in the corporate scene, how many fights are you going to fight? What a genius are you? If you fight every fight, no one will back you. No matter what your IQ is. So Coolidge knew that. A very, very different type, more like George Washington, knew when to be a hero, very like Lincoln, team of rivals, did not pick strong people to work for him and did not emasculate them.
Yeah, it sounds like we had a very prudent president in Calvin Coolidge and an ISI man for sure. And before we move on, we're going to move on to Q&A here in a minute. And I just want to say a little word here and say that if you've been enjoying tonight's event, this is just a taste of what ISI offers student members. If you are tired of progressive orthodoxy on campus and eager to go beyond the narrow range of debate in the classroom, then come and learn the timeless principles of liberty with ISI. ISI introduces students to the American tradition of liberty and to a vibrant community of students and scholars. Our members get an education in a community they don't find at their universities, and in the process, they become articulate voices for conservative principles. To get the college education you deserve, become a member today at join.isi.org, and you can find that link right at the top of the chat alongside a link to the Coolidge Foundation website, and you should check out both. And so now we're going to move on to some Q&A from our viewers. Here we go. Okay, here's one. This is from Daniel Hagler. Are there any similarities today to the time of the Great Depression? And I'll add to that, to the time of the Great Society.
Well, yeah, I tend to compare where we're headed. I tend to fear we're heading into the 70s, not the 30s. Nominally, our unemployment is shockingly high. So that's like the 30s when unemployment hit 25%, or when industrial production plummeted. It's another thing that's been happening if you look at GDP. But I don't think GDP is an awesome metric. You can question GDP as a number. I think it's more like the 70s when we spent a lot, and then we, our international, what's the word, primacy? Domination? Primacy, our leadership was challenged, and people wondered if the US would fail, and our currency was challenged, and we had terrible inflation. So right now, we feel that no matter what we do as a people, inflation will never come. And there's this odd paradox that when the US does something wrong, it gets stronger because it causes world instability and money flows to the US, because the US is still the strongest, safest place. That can end. The currency can be challenged. It's easier for our currency to be challenged than it might have been 10 years ago because of technology. There could be a challenge far more formidable than the Bitcoin. I'm sure there's some Bitcoin fans here, but maybe with a little bit of a commodity in it, or a government, and also perhaps a company. Nike dollars or whatever. Google. So PayPal could become a currency. You can. I hope you've talked to Peter Thiel. It may already be one. Or something like that. Point being, if the dollar is challenged, that will affect what we can buy, what we can sell, what kind of house we can have, what our taxes are, all that. And that's like the 70s, which were the very spongy, duplicitous, demoralizing decade.
Thank you for that answer. And we have another question from Kurt Byron. And this one is about President Coolidge. It says, Coolidge was in part famous for his speech on the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, indicating that certain self-evident truths are, quote, final. What has happened to those, quote, final truths? How can we re-energize Coolidge's famous words?
Oh, thank you for saying that. He said about the Coolidge liked to invert his sentences and moves the words around. That was because he knew Latin. The beauty of Latin is you can move the words around. It's an inflected language like Greek or German or Russian. And so he did that a lot. He knew Latin. He said, about the Constitution, there is a finality that is exceedingly restful. If all men are equal, that is final. I'll just stop there. What he was saying is all we need to get our polity to where we want to be is in our Constitution already. We don't need a resolution. We need better observance of the principles to which we already agreed to adhere that have served us well in the past. So his thought was that America would get better if it were left alone. He would have argued, I think, that we haven't left it alone. Instead, we've created, from the worst legacy of the Great Society is that we created a culture of entitlement rather than obligation and duty. So poor people think that they should get money, that that's the answer, instead of that they should have opportunity. And we did that through the Great Society. So if we can show other Americans that opportunity is the key to their prosperity, well-being, and flourishing, then the rest will follow.
Thank
It's a very important speech. I will mention, I've given talks about this speech. This is the sesquicentennial July speech of, I guess it would be 26, right? Anyway, it's for on the occasion of the 4th of July, but Coolidge, there's a tension in it between religion and observance of law. I mean, that is earthly law. Coolidge was well aware of that. Coolidge was a man who said, "Men do not make laws, they do but discover them." He had great respect for the faith behind the framers, the bedrock. And I think the question of which Coolidge thought was more important might be decided or deemed decided by the date on which he chose to give this speech. This famous 4th of July speech was given on July 5. And that was because July 4 was Sunday. And politicians didn't give speeches on Sunday.
A different day.
For anyone who's looking at the duel between faith and government, at least someone decided that, maybe partly Coolidge. The 4th of July speech was on Monday. I found that absolutely hilarious when I figured that out. He was aware that you don't. You can fill the space with individual liberty. You can fill it with religious faith. But anyway, he was aware that there was these other things men did that were so important. The material is not that important. The government is not that important. Things of the spirit, he said, were important.
Thank you for that. Thank you. And I would like to ask, what was it about Coolidge's upbringing? You talked sort of a little bit about his Latin skills that gave him the ability to construct sentences, but what else about how he was raised, how he was educated growing up? If I remember correctly, he was educated in a one-room schoolhouse in Vermont. What about his upbringing made him the man that he was? What were some particular things you think that affected him?
Yeah, well, let's say he inhaled some things and he read some things.
Okay.
He grew up in a very small town without electricity, where the sun goes down before 5 o'clock. Gosh, I hope I'm right, but I don't have the data point. I have that feeling just round then, because the mountain is in the way of the setting sun. If you have a large mountain, as mountain people know, in the way of the sun disappears earlier. So it was dark, it was cold. The railroad was all over the United States, expanding everywhere. The railroad did not choose to come to Plymouth Notch. The grade of the road was too steep. So imagine a town, time passed by, that's supposed to be a farming town. Not a single acre of Plymouth Notch, where Coolidge is from in Vermont, was rated arable later by agricultural experts. So you live in a farming town where you farm rocks, and the food doesn't come, and you have to go all the way to Boston on the train to sell your half, your cheese. The Coolidges made cheese. There was no electrification. What is cheese? It's an exercise in economic desperation when you have no train and no electricity to keep your milk from spoiling. Cheese. So that's what he came from. But I wouldn't say they were poor in that way, because they were not poor in spirit. They were almost like ambassadors to the New World, or missionaries. They come for a certain reason to the United States. The Coolidges did come over early to Boston and then went to the West, which would be Vermont. Think of Vermont was the West then, to the pioneer place, where they roughed it. But for God, for independence, for all the reasons we rough it, that was going on. But they were not quite unsophisticated. They were there by choice. They left England by choice. And that comes through. His grandmother was a Northern Baptist, She didn't like dancing. The culture was mixed, but more or less default Congregationalist, I would say. Their church was non-denominational because they couldn't afford a minister. Remember, a minister was your television before TV and radio. He was your entertainment, right? As well as your inspiration and your pastor. They couldn't afford a minister, so they had the rotating kind. But they weren't totally poor. The Coolidges didn't have a lot of money, but they had assets. They were just illiquid. Some were farmers. Coolidge's father ran the store. Coolidge's grandfather had tried his hand at different things. His grandfather, Calvin Galusha, was very entrepreneurial. He got a stallion to put out to stud because he thought that might work. He tried merino sheep when Australia challenged us with their sheep. Coolidge developed a horror of mutton, of sheep for dinner, not lamb, but the grown-up sheep. He saw so much of it, I would suspect. But he was always, a thoughtful kid, and he went to boarding school, which is what they did then when they couldn't ride the bus to high school. You couldn't go 5 miles without a car or a train, so you had to board or stay. And then he went to university. So I would say his family was not poor, but certainly didn't have a lot of cash. His father was very upright. They were all very upright. His mother passed when he was a child, as his sister. He was extremely well acquainted with death.
Thank you for that. That was really helpful to help us sort of think about what shaped Coolidge, right? And
thinking about Amherst at the time, Amherst is a zealous college now. If we have any Amherst people, is zealous in a new way. It was zealous then in a way of religious faith. College has always been hotbeds, just different kinds of hotbeds.
Sure. Thank you. And one of the questions I would like to also ask, which has come up in the chat or in the Q&A a couple times now, is how would President Coolidge have handled the COVID pandemic? Is there any way we can sort of gauge how he would have reacted to a emergency like this one?
Oh, there is plenty of evidence. First of all, we have an expectation that no one must ever die. Kind of a new thing. You can set aside whether you approve of that or not. They expected people to die, and they died all the time of tuberculosis. He came from a tubercular village. People thought Coolidge wouldn't make it himself. His mother died, sister died. Everyone around him lost children. People lost children all the time. So they just had a different expectation of what can be done in an emergency, not that much. The big national emergency, it wasn't that they didn't have pity. They just had a very limited expectation of what authorities could do in the face of death. So the death confronted the Mississippi River Valley when there was a giant flood of the Mississippi, a Katrina at the time. And you think some of you may know that President Bush had to confront Katrina, and there was flooding, and the question was, would Bush go? Coolidge saw the Mississippi flood, and it was a much bigger flood. Hundreds of thousands of acres were covered. Thousands and thousands of people were displaced. And Coolidge did not go. Why? Because he did not want to send a precedent of the federal government being responsible for the redevelopment, particularly of the area. The redevelopment, that is the building of all the new dams and bridges and river systems, that the Army Corps of Engineers type stuff, knew if he went and were photographed with all the horror and the pity, and there was, then he would not be able to veto such spending. He would be overridden. Created the photo op. He said, it's not the president's job. The states should take care of disasters. And what's very dramatic and kind of biblical about it is, in irony, the Southern senator said, what a rat Fink Coolidge is. He didn't go down. He doesn't care because it's not his constituency. He would go, one lawmaker said, if it were New England that were flooding. And lo and behold, New England did flood. Vermont flooded. The lieutenant governor drowned trying to get out of his car. In Barrie or Montpelier, one of those Vermont towns, it was a terrible flood. Hundreds of covered bridges were washed away. The rails, such as they were, and there were many railroads in Vermont, just not in Plymouth, were washed away. The whole Christmas tree harvest was washed away. And Coolidge, well, it was his state. He did not go. Why not? He wanted to be consistent. He can't do for his own what he didn't do for others. That was the line that the Vermont press said. He was president of the United States, not president of Vermont. Had he been governor of Vermont, he would have gone. So there was none of this, I'll fight for my town and get them a better baseball stadium or football stadium culture in Coolidge. He said it would be a debasing of the presidency if I advocated for my ex-constituents. And Vermonters really did understand. He went back a year or two later, and he was greeted with great affection. They understood that he wanted to come, but he thought it was wrong for a president to favor one town. So that attitude still exists. We all understand it, but we have to remind ourselves how close it is to us. Coolidge was not that long away. He wasn't George Washington. He conducted conference calls. He loved technology and airplanes. And yet he had this very good sense, I think, of the limits of government and of reinforcing their limits and not eroding them. Because what is a crisis like this? It's a nightmare for federalism and restraint, because then you're called cruel if you don't argue for spending. And it looks worse in such instances.
And this really leads us into the final question that I'll ask you tonight. A student asks, what is it that makes Coolidge's type of conservatism, Coolidge's free market nature, not the common sense position anymore? Why is it seen as sort of the, and not the right position in today's time?
I don't, if the interest rate goes above 10%, people will look for Coolidge's. They'll call back Paul Ryan, right? They'll look for budget cutters or people who at least acknowledge the importance. Right now, it's to say we're sort of on OxyContin, all of us, right? That our economy. We're not in a real economy. We're in an economy full of. So maybe that'll last forever. I don't think so. So in a real economy, who can address the pain and actually make it better will be someone with some restraint, and suddenly Coolidge will look good. But in addition, I have always had trouble with the way parties, including the Republican Party, pander to voters rather than show leadership. If you tell people there's a benefit, $1,000 check, they're going to be a fool not to take it or even fight for it, right? There are free textbooks in the room down the hall. Well, I don't approve of free textbooks, but as long as they're there, I'm going to go get one because I'd be a fool not to, particularly because I might not be able to order them because they might run out since so many have been given away free, right? You often find yourself in that situation. You have the question whether you take advantage of something even though you don't approve of it. That's our politics. The Republican Party can do better than that. Maybe the Democratic Party can do better than that. Maybe one of you can start a party that will be more common sense, that has people from both groupings. But our politicians baby us, and I know you resent that. I certainly do.
And I lied. I'm going to ask you one more follow-up on that. What can ISI students who are out there thinking about being in public service, thinking about being in academia, thinking about all these different career paths potentially, what can they do to cultivate the virtues that Coolidge had?
Well, build up new institutions. If you spend all your time attacking somebody you don't agree with, say a progressive person is writing the wrong thing on the internet, you're wasting your time. What you should be doing is building up ISI and supporting it, or building up Coolidge and supporting it, or building up your own club that you're supporting. In the moment when monuments are being torn down, it's our job to build up monuments and not to worry too much what the others are saying or doing. Mostly they're wrong. So we don't have to worry about that.
Thank you. Thank you. And to all of our ISI students and others watching tonight, thank you for being here. And I highly recommend that if you have not yet, check out The Forgotten Man, check out Great Society, and check out anything else that Ms. Shlaes has written is really wonderfully crafted. And we look forward to seeing you all in the next episode of Conservative Conversations with ISPAC. See you soon.
Thank you for the time.
Thank you for coming.